experience or not, but you did a lot of work when you were at NDRI in terms of modern and different applications of the model. And you know, whether that was homeless, you did that work. I think it was at Bellevue.
Yeah.
Where you took it into Bellevue, you took it into methadone clinics.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's such a really incredible example of the importance of people understanding the theory and the model, because then you can change the forms to fit the population.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people really realize the extent to which, just in your body of work, your experience, that you have applied it in many diverse settings.
That's right.
As well as many diverse cultures.
That's right.
You know, Belgium and so forth. So that might be something to articulate, because I remember when you were talking to me about bringing very strong elements of the TC into Bellevue, and with really positive effects on people's mental health.
Yeah. It's I mean, it's an extremely important point that you're making. And it does relate to a larger question of the application of the so-called modified TC, you know what I mean, for these different populations. And it's true. I had just, I'll kind of approach the point with a little bit of a narrative, and that is that I was able to get good support from National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, to essentially fund a center for therapeutic community research, which incidentally was the only example, to my knowledge, of NIDA funding a center for research for a particular modality. They had never done that. So we were able to achieve that, and incidentally, the Donovan study comes out of that funding. That's where Harry got his funding. Because that study was part of the center's portfolio. You know what I mean? In terms. So, but the entire mission of that center was the application of therapeutic communities for special populations and special settings. Some of that work was written and contained in a book called Community as Method. Applications of therapeutic communities in special settings. Pamela has that book. It's a wildly expensive book. I hate that fact that the publishers made all the money. I don't want the money on it, but they made all the money on it. And they priced it out of, I think, existence. But we should have that book on the shelf, because it's 15 different programs, all modified therapeutic communities, for different populations, and one of them that Naya is talking about is the one that I developed at Bellevue Hospital in New York, at NYU Bellevue Hospital, well-known ancient psychiatric hospital, you know, with a great tradition. But that old Bellevue Hospital psychiatric building was being reconverted into essentially a large shelter. And they had an alcohol floor for alcoholics. And we were able to go in with the support of Mark Gallanter, who was the psychiatrist there and director of alcohols and drugs at NYU. We were able to go into that hospital and convert the 6th floor of Bellevue into a TC. And what was striking about that, and of course there are many important questions to ask about how adaptable it really is, but what I want to emphasize to you is just the opening element of changing the physical environment of the 6th floor was a critical example of how, applying what we know about the therapeutic community and the meaning of environment, and then also demonstrating, you know, what happens when you do that with this particular population, not only in that kind of a building, what happens to the building when you do that, but what happens to this population. And it's important to understand, just talking about now this population is one of the major applications, that this was an authentic psychiatric population. This was schizophrenics and manic depressives, bipolar disorder, largely, all of whom had involvement with substance abuse. They were the classical co-occurring disorder, dually disordered clients. It's not simply the same clients that come into the TCs, community-based TCs, many of whom have psychiatric issues, we know that, but this was the more classical psychiatric population, schizophrenics and bipolar disorder, who also had substance abuse problems. And it was always believed, almost from the first days of TCs, that the TC could not work with these clients. Tom McClellan was an early antagonist on this, saying, because he was associated with the VA hospital in Pennsylvania, and he's arguing that it didn't work, and he was talking about a 4-month program there. I never saw it, but whatever it was, he concluded it didn't work. Sherry Holland successfully, I think, contradicted it, but her position was never publicized. We wanted to see whether you really could apply the model for a serious disturbed population. And you certainly had to modify it. And, and one was a key modification, of course, is they were all on psychotropic medication. But could they really run a house structure? Could you have a hierarchy? Could they sit in groups? Could they essentially take some disciplinary and privilege, in that setting? All of that was demonstrated. And not only that, the whole thing was under an evaluation. That was Stan Sachs running that evaluation. And we were able to demonstrate that for these clients, 2 outcomes would occur. Namely, that you can get a positive change in their behavioral, their drug use outcome, and their criminal deviance outcomes, but also in their psychiatric status. That it's a finding we don't make enough noise about. It's one of the reasons I'm talking about it now, even years later. It was a profound finding that these clients, virtually all of them who remained 4 or 5 months in there, showed significant declines in their symptomatology. They all felt better and looked better. And a third of them actually changed their diagnosis. That is
That's huge.
Yeah, that's huge. Change the diagnosis.
What were the changes that you made in the physical environment? Because that also may be an element that we really don't talk enough about in the TC world, is how much the physical environment can affect psychological space.
No question
and
about
sanctuary.
it. It's something I've adhered to a lot. If anybody has read the Red Book, do you know my Red Book, the Red Book, Therapeutic Community Theory, Model, and Method? There's in one of those chapters, there's a fairly extensive discussion on environment. And so based on that discussion, or as illustrated in that discussion, it was simply try to get as close to a community residence in this hospital, converting this hospital ward. So immediately signs, photograph, pictures, paintings, front desk. So as soon as you walk out of the elevator, you had a resident sitting at the, when they came out of the elevator. You think of a hospital, and here the elevator opens, no nurses, right? None of that. No nursing station. And simply you have a resident with a sign in, all the accoutrements of like that, and everything designed. And you really didn't have a lot of room. You got when you get into these institutional settings, you got nothing to work with really, and you're in this one large room that has to convert. The scene has to change, for 5 different kinds of activities. You're always just changing the set, to do this, You come in. This is luxuria. Here is total luxury in this program. So we had to basically communicate the sense through signage, through photographs, through positioning of the residents, and of course, what's on the walls was very important because you were really now spelling out the program on the wall, and so people were reading, what is right living and so on, and if you participate, then you will change. All the exhortations that the TC makes. And of course, what was dramatic about that, and as minimal as that was, namely the modifications of the physical environment, its intention, its therapeutic intention, was to immediately establish for these clients that they were in a different environment. Forget about that; it was not that enriched, you know what I mean? But it was a different environment. It's not prison. It's not the emergency room. It's not the hospital room. It's not even the alcohol clinic upstairs. You know what I mean? Which still looked like a hospital. You know, and to the extent that we achieved that, it was very important because it also, in terms of classical TC, adhered to basic requirements. You had the residents that had maintained that environment. So that was very critical, and I sell that wherever we go. That as drab and as limited as the physical environment might be, you must convert that into a separate space. So the intention is not that I may not be able to get as enriched and beautiful, but the main outcome from that is we've changed it enough so that you know it's separate. Even in the prisons, I'm always walking around in the prisons talking about this, you know, because there they limit you totally. And so the key is, we did achieve that it was a separate space, because when visitors would start to come, they would get off the elevator and they'd suddenly find, wait a minute, where am I in this, you know? And of course that happened to the residents too, you know, they know they're in a separate, and then of course that's one of the underlying activities for creating ownership and affiliation of the space, because they have to maintain that it's theirs. And once you're essentially creating a sense of ownership, you increase participation. When you increase participation, you start to see changes.
Did you think at all when you were doing that about the history of Bellevue with addiction and, you know, the coming full circle to bring something like that there? Because I know you're familiar with how addicts were treated in Bellevue before the alternative, the TC was developed, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because Bellevue was renowned, really.
Well, yeah,
and not in a good way.
No, I know, and yes, I wouldn't say it was a frontline agenda item for me. You know, we're gonna somehow now challenge the historical picture about Bellevue. I was actually on this point. I was very appreciative, and this I mentioned his name before, but I need to mention that Mark Gallant, who was a traditional psychiatrist, but an addiction psychiatrist. He's a conventional psychiatrist and in addiction medicine, and he runs the division of alcohol and drug abuse at NYU. And how supportive he was of this, and still is. You know, we don't have it there anymore, and I'll tell you what happened to it. But it did last for 20 years. And think about that. You know, but in terms of this issue, the kind of the historical slant that occurred to me was not so much the negative picture, but that here was Bellevue now somehow as one of the great traditional a legendary, iconic psychiatric hospital worldwide that rivals with some of the European psychiatric centers in Switzerland and so on. That here was Bellevue making this change. We had a therapeutic community in this psychiatric hospital, and the achievement was, well, we're making a mark in psychiatry. You know what I mean? This is and so I always experienced it from that point of view, rather than rather underscore how bad it was in the